Hi, everybody, and welcome to the SCA Coaches Corner. This is the monthly series, Heroes and Traditions, and we are continuing our content on the Kingdom of Atenveldt. This will be part 2 of that. We'll look at the last 25 years or so. We are blessed to have my co-host here, Duke Brennan. He does all the heavy lifting and thinking for me, and I'm the pretty one. So, Brennan, welcome to the show.
Glad to be back. Excited for round 2 of Atenveldt. We have a couple excellent guests tonight. We are pleased to be joined by Count Merrick the Jew. Merrick has been playing in the SGA since around 2000 and has mainly lived in Atenveldt with some stints in Caid and Trimaris, but always participated in his own kingdom and was squire to Duke Tristan Dragonheart. And then we have Sir Valora. Valora began in the SCA around 2005-ish, was squire to Duke Phelan, and has been Atenveldter from the beginning. And any regular viewer of Coach's Corner, of course, knows the great and powerful Duke Sean of Artemisia.
Yes, well, all hail the great and powerful Sean.
Yes, all hail.
Hey, Sean, why don't you give us a super quick recap of what we did last month?
Right. So, we covered a little bit about Atenveldt as the first principality of the society, which was new and adventurous then. A little bit there. We had Count Dennis on. He covered a lot of the early stuff for us. Talked about the 70s with Dennis and Deaton and some of the early development there, including the break off of Meridies and Anstior as principalities. And then got a little bit into the 80s where we had talked quite a bit about my knight, Brian, and another legendary figure of Atenveldt, Duke Trelawn, among some of the highlights of the 80s there. So it looks like I'm breaking up. So it was a great discussion, and so definitely happy to be part of this continuation here.
So on our first episode, we also had Count Dennis, and we would have loved to have had Dennis stay with us again. While he was a prowess competitor those first 25 years, he's never really left Atenveldt's, at all. If he may not have been fighting very much after a certain period, but he has always been around. He's been marshaling. He's been involved, and we regret not having Count Dennis with us tonight. He was a great guest, and if there was a way I could figure out how to have him in every episode, I would, just because he makes us all sound really good. So the last thing we did was we kind of summed up the 80s. And, so we're going to jump into the 90s now. One of the first things that we do, while we don't necessarily, ducal-centric or even crown-centric, but it is a metric for who was winning tournaments and big tournaments during any period of time. And during the 90s, there was a number of gentlemen who won crown, either finished their second Atenveldt crown or finished a second crown while in Atenveldt. And we have Thorfinn in 1992, Mark in 1992, who coincidentally is the current crown of Atenveldt after a long gap. Man, whose name is pronounced differently than that. Someone want to take a stab at Man's actual name?
Oh, no, it's pronounced man.
It's spelled Math Command Man.
Yeah, it's spelled not how it sounds.
It's spelled like Netflix, but it's pronounced man.
Oh, that'd be like if my name was pronounced Al.
Yeah.
All right. So Duke Mann in 1998, and then his very good friend Duke Arthur right behind him in 1999. And then we will close out the 90s with Duke Aaron Graves, who won his second crown in 2000. So those were the people who won their second crowns during this period. There were a number of other people who won first crowns or were dominant. So kind of let's jump. I think, Merrick, you've been a little longer than Valora. Why don't we start with you from a concept of when did you join the SCA, and then what might be your, even if it's just you heard about rather than knew about any of these figures from the 90s proper.
No, I started laughing just because I always kind of it's a little blurry when I started. I either started in '99 or 2000. I can't remember the exact year, but it was right around that time. And for me, I think the first name that I would have known would have been Mans, and that was just because I played in the Barony of Twin Moons, which he was the founding Baron of. And because, and I'll be honest, starting out in a mercenary household, there was a long period of time when I played when I didn't even understand how somebody became a knight, much less how somebody became a king or a count or a duke, or for that matter. So being in a mercenary household and being hired quite, honestly, frequently sometimes by Twin Moons, being is that we trained there and we played there. Man was definitely man and probably Art were the first people that I would have known and recognized from that era.
And we'll get to Sean, because Sean actually can give a little bit more detail from having actually swung sticks at all those guys. But Valora, when did you start? And then of the names of any of the people who were prominent in the 90s, what's the one that really stands out to you?
I started in 2005, 2006-ish, and I got to be incredibly lucky because when I first started fighting, I got to fight at Elias's backyard practice, and both Mark and Aaron attended that practice. So I got to meet both of them very early on in my career.
It's potentially a lot of pain you're having to duck early on.
Oh, yes, very, very much so. Mark is an amazing teacher.
Well,
and nothing's changed after all that time.
Sean, you definitely have a lot of firsthand information, first stick information. These were all guys that were, in a sense, your contemporaries. During this period. So, what stands out in your mind?
Yeah, when you're looking at, in particular, the dukes that were made in the '90s, and the thing that you notice there is, there's a couple of early on in '92, and then there's a few others late, and there seems to be this kind of gap in the middle. And so Thorfinn was my squire brother. Mark was squired to Trelawn, and I got a lot of influence from Trelawn as well. I was hanging out with Mark when we were all squires together. So in the midst of, because Thorfinn and Mark were crowns back to back early on. And, so you still have the influence of Brian and Trelawn. You have Mark and Thorfinn early on. And then Brian and Trelawn still had a couple of reigns in the middle there as well. And I think Thorfinn ended up having a total of 3 reigns through the 90s. I think his last one, I want to say, was right after I got out of the military, so like 95 or thereabout. So some of the guys that were heavy influences in the 80s were still pretty influential in the early to mid 90s. And then I think, something that kind of coincides with what you're seeing as far as, the folks that have come along after is in 1997, Artemisia became a kingdom. And right before that, late of 96, because it was the middle of my reign as prince. I was the second to last prince of Artemisia. Brian and Anna moved back to the East Kingdom, and Trelawn and Varia moved back to Meridies. And so right there in the mid 90s, these two guys who had been pretty influential for a long time were just gone. And that's kind of where you see, Man and Arthur and Aaron, and then, early on into the 2000s, there's a couple of others that had some reigns, Eric had his first reign in the 90s, and then a second reign into the 2000s as well, Eric and Nichelle. So, like I said, you kind of see that gap early on, because some of those guys were still, playing pretty hard and winning crowns.
I'm glad you brought up Eric. Just not to, but Eric was somebody that I was trying to think of when his reigns were, and I couldn't remember if his second reign was in the 90s or not. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, because Eric was Eric was king of Atenveldt when I was prince of Artemisia, so that was 96. That was the first reign for Eric and Michelle. And they were pretty influential in the transition from from us being a principality to a kingdom. And that was Man's first reign as well, was part of that, because Man and when Man was king, Basil was prince. They had made the announcement at Coronet List that we were going to be pursuing status as a kingdom, and in order to enter that list, you had to basically, part of the sword oath at that time was that you would continue to pursue the path to kingdom. And that was something that Man, as Man and Katie as crown, had kind of supported. So they were pretty huge in the support for us moving in that direction.
So thinking about you have these two giants that are driving so much of culture from our conversation last time, and they both move out of kingdom. Does that really change the way that folks train there, or what happens in the aftermath of that? Do we watch the rise of new folks, or what fills that void?
I mean, for me, when I look back and I think back, I mean, the SCA was such a strong force back then. We had it was really such a a powerful social group. I mean, I kind of came in after some of these trainers that we're talking about from the 90s, but for me, I mean, I remember Man. I mean, he would drive a Sunday practice every Sunday, which Art really kind of drives now. And for at least for me in the East Valley, I mean, Man and some of the guys from Twin Moons again. Really kind of drove some of that training, for myself, and a lot of my friends that were kind of coming up together. So that vacuum was definitely filled by because if I started in the early 2000s, right, then the previous generation was obviously jumping in and filling that void for sure, at least in my experience.
So by the time, I'm sorry, go ahead, Valora.
No, I was gonna say, no, I think for me was the biggest difference is when you have such big winners that have won a lot, when they leave, it opened it up, at least in my opinion, for other styles, if that makes sense, where you didn't have to learn to fight sword and shield like Trelon. You didn't have to learn this like this guy. It opened it up for people to start putting their own spin on fighting, and up for just different styles in general.
So Merrick, showing up around 99, 2000, what does training look like in that era? Is it show up and bang? Is it is it an organized class in the sparring? What does training look like around then?
Honestly, the first thing that came to my head was a lot of pain. And it's just the reality. I think the culture, has changed in that regard in a lot of ways for the better. I mean, and again, that also comes from the perspective of a person who was very much a fringe player, and at the time had no desire to stop being a fringe player, but wanted to be better at fighting, right? So, I mean, there was a small group of us that were going out, to Barony of Atenveldt and Barony of Twin Moons on a regular basis. And there was actually, a couple of guys that kind of blazed that path before I started taking it seriously. But by the time we were all there in force, I mean, it was really a lot of taking your beatings and taking your licks, and then a couple of guys a couple of knights saying, wait a minute, these guys aren't going anywhere. Like, they just keep coming back for more, and they do it with a smile on their face every week. And maybe we should take some time and actually teach them some things. Like, they're here for a reason. They're trying to learn. They're taking our beatings instead of treating them like a pell like we have been for a while. Maybe we should put some time into them, and then of course eventually some of us became, went from that fringy path to the more mainstream path, like become squires and really taking on that training mentality. I can remember Sir Gregory Winterson, who was actually my first knight before for very amicable reasons severed that relationship, and then moved, eventually squired to Tristan. I mean, he would hold a weekly Pell practice that a lot of us from Twin Moons would go to. And, that from a class perspective, that's where the class took place. The class never took place on the battlefield, so to speak, or the training field. The class really started taking place in that time period in the Pell practice, and that's where you started to learn how to actually throw shots and throw techniques and think about shield placement while you're trying to while you're trying to figure out how to throw a shot, well, you got to think about where your shield is too, right? And that's kind of where that formal class started taking place for me, at least.
And was that Pell practice common throughout Atenveldt?
I honestly don't know.
Okay,
I wasn't plugged in enough to know at the time.
fair enough.
I'd say even now you can kind of see that Twin Moons is more of a training centric practice, and some of the other practices are a little bit more sparring centric practices. I don't know, Al-Anon, you kind of moved in recently. I don't know if that fits your observations as well, but that's kind of how I see it from afar.
I think that's pretty fair. I know that some of the Tucson households are more training centric than than some of the other areas within the kingdom. But kind of like what what they do over on the western side of the valley. I mean, they're training by doing. We always like to say that you get a lot more if you're actually doing targeted training and specific paths and stuff like that than if you're just fighting. And that's true unless you're doing a ton of fighting. And if you're doing a ton of fighting, your path to prowess is still there. And, so they may not do as much, let's break it down and work on something per se, but gosh, they fight a lot out there.
Not to interrupt, the only thing I do want to say that they do a little bit differently on the west side, from a, and again, now we're talking about more modern day than we are talking about back in the 2000s. But just to clarify, but the big thing, especially on the west coast or on the west side that they, in Atenveldt that they do, was say they, they're a lot more. Well, what Al-Anon says is right. What they do is there's a lot more fighting, right? And you're learning by doing, but they also do a lot more video analysis than we do, on the east side in Twin Moons. So there's that. I mean, I think they're still taking that training mentality. They're just approaching it from a different angle, right? So now they're doing their fighting, and then they're going back and they're reanalyzing their video from what are we seeing that they did right and wrong. Versus kind of the Twin Moons mentality, which is more of a, well, what are you working on? How can I help you progress? Where are you stuck? Is it physical? Is it mental? Whatever the case may be. And I think it's just different training philosophies and approaches at that point.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily think it's inferior one way or the other, because what they might not do so formal, they more than make up for with just repetition and work. And I actually also think they'll take that video analysis and have more of a one-on-one with a more experienced fighter and a less experienced fighter kind of a thing. So while it may not feel like, okay, let's everyone gather around, let's talk about something, the way it might be done. And it's so funny because when we're talking about east side and west side, we're just talking about east and west side, the
Phoenix.
valley, which is Phoenix.
Right? Yeah.
Same city, kind of. So, so I don't know. I can't really speak to what it was, back in the 90s, but that's a little bit of the flavor for things now, I think.
But
I think getting back to the history of it, I think you can kind of see that evolution kind of starting, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. You can kind of see some of those differences kind of started to form.
Yeah, and to add on that, back when I think back to the the 90s and 2000s, and going back to the comment you made about the fact east side, west side. I mean, one of the advantages that Atenveldt really has is that our population is so condensed in a centralized area that, I mean, it's really not hard to go to multiple practices a week. I've been, for those of us that are fortunate enough to travel, and even try to find practices, that are not necessarily, your regular everyday backyard or regular everyday baronial, organized practices, across the country. I mean, we've always been kind of spoiled in Atenveldt, regardless of what our population numbers have been, because, I mean, if I want to, I can go to a practice Monday night. I can go to a practice, if I'm only 2 hours from Tucson on Tuesday night. I'm 30 minutes or 30 minutes from Twin Moons on a Thursday night. Sun Dragon has recently moved to Thursday night, but they used to be on Sundays, right?
BOA on Wednesdays.
B of A on Wednesdays. Private practices on Sundays. I mean, there was almost only one day a week where you couldn't find a practice, and that was I guess
Saturday.
Friday and Saturday, right?
Yeah.
And then Saturday there was usually an event where you could, guess what, you could fight at it, you know. So I mean, I wouldn't do it now in my 40s, but you know, back when I was in my 20s and 30s, fighting 5, 6, sometimes 7 days a week wasn't unheard of, you know. And so, you know, it goes back to what, you know, kind of what, you know, Eleanor was talking about was, you know, that repetition, that suit time, and you know, and that school of hard knocks of taking your beatings and learning through repetition. You know, so that was still very much a part of it in the 90s, and you know, in the 90s and going into the 2000s.
So I do know actually started in the West Side practice. That was my first practice, was the Monday night practice. And by mid 2000s, it had already developed into a very structured. So I imagine that they spent most of the 90s and the early 2000s developing that structure, because it was already, you came in, you did warm-up shots on the Pell, then you do a bear pit, then they would pick a concept that we were all gonna work on that day. So it would be like range or shot selection or combos, and they would teach it, and then you would do more fighting to try and work that into your fight. And then they would do group video breakdown where they would film us and the entire group would get together, because what I see in a fight is not what Ailgheanan's going to see in a fight, which is not what Sean's going to see in a fight. Yep. So they would get for large group discussions and just, what are you seeing? What are you not seeing? And then people could go, wait, I didn't see that. How are you saying he should have done this? So lots of big group discussions, and then also like even melee tactic discussions. So but it was already that by the time I got there. So that had to develop in the early 90s, 2000s to that point already.
You know, it's interesting you bring up that analysis of how you guys were kind of doing it with the video and stuff even back then, because, you know, one of the biggest things we would do from an analytical standpoint, you know, and, you know, I really kind of, we kind of do it every now and then, but I kind of wish we did it more on the regular, is, you know, at the end of the night, we would kind of get in a circle and everybody would kind of give their feedback. We'd go around and say, you know, Valora, I fought you today, and this is what I noticed, or, you know, and so forth and so on, and kind of give that verbal feedback at the end of the night. And one of the nice things about that I found was that instead of getting that constant feedback throughout the night and constantly, you know, especially when you're a new fighter and you're being bogged down by like, you know, 6, 7, 20 guys that who are people, you know, fighters that are out, you know, that night, and getting bogged down by being pushed in 20 different directions, you know, which can be really overwhelming sometimes, especially as a new fighter. You're kind of getting it all at the end, right? And you know, and sometimes there would be those people that were like, you know what, I'm sorry guys, like I just came out to fight for whatever reason, or I'm working on my own thing. You know, I came out to be with my friends and socialize, you know, or I'm just trying to get work, you know, get the day of work off my back, and, you know, kind of relax and do my thing. And some people were just, you know, honest about, you know, like, I'm not here to analyze, I'm not here to train, I'm really just here to swing some stick and be with my friends and be social and, you know, try to forget my day at work. And, you know, that was okay too. You know, you have
That's
to allow
a really cool thing. Every time I saw that happen, not only did I think that it was a beneficial from a training concept, but it's super beneficial from the notion of we're a community. We have come together to practice, and even if those two people kind of went over there and those two people went over there and these 3 or 4 people were working on here, and if everyone comes back together at the end as a group, it was our practice, you know, instead of my practice. It was you know, and I think that sense of community a lot of fighters are looking for. And when we talk about, you know, things that we can do to encourage people to join the SCA going forward, it's remembering those aspects of community and togetherness that I think are really, you know, they help a lot. A lot of people crave that. So, and I know I do too. I mean, more so than I crave the need to tell people how they were doing. I like that we come together and did that as a group.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the things that we've gotten away from to that point, I mean, you know, is just that simple, whether it was, you know, in the way back times when I first started in the late 90s, early 2000s, you'd get done with practice on Wednesdays and a bunch of us would go to karaoke and have a few beers at the end of the after practice. And, you know, then for a while there, you know, on the east side in Twin Moons, it was, you know, you get done with practice and you'd go to, you know, the local bar and, you know, have some appetizers and hang out and have a couple of drinks. And, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the reason why we all do this is that sense of community, right? I mean, even, when we talk about fighting, I've always talked about being more of a melee fighter than a tourney fighter, because on the melee field, I get to fight with my friends instead of against my friends. It's that, and that's where that camaraderie really starts to come out for me, right? And that's why that's the part that I love more than anything else. So at the end of the day, I think, what we're, as much as we all want to be great fighters and be the best out there, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all selling community and trying to just, be part of that group where we feel like we belong.
So during this period, before we move from the 90s to the aughts, are there any, not necessarily, ducal new dukes or even crown winners or whatever? Are there standout prowess people, whether it's from a training perspective or, are they just badasses, they didn't want to fight in crown? Anyone that stands out that we should mention or make sure that we talk about before we move from one decade to the next? I'd hate to forget anyone that was important.
I'm trying. I'm so bad at remembering years, but I'm glad we already brought up Eric. Because I mean, Eric was such I mean, if he were to be out, he would still be. I mean, he was such a phenomenal fighter on the field, and I have to give props to Jonathan Whitewolf as well. I mean, he's always been an incredible stick. He's always been a incredible font of knowledge for the sport that we choose to participate in, and he's been playing it in his entire life and grew up in it. And to that point, I have to add, I don't think he definitely hadn't won a crown yet, but, Duke Morgan of the Oaks also, I mean, even at a young age was always a very, a really great fight and a great fighter. And, he had that generational advantage and knowledge to pass down even before he kind of had any recognition of his own.
Cool.
I'd say Craven. I don't know if he had won a crown yet in the early 90s.
No, not yet.
But from all the stories that I've heard, it was kind of that group of squires that were really pushing each other to become better and to be better at fighting and to really kind of break down fighting in a training aspect. So I would include Craven in there.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Sean?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Craven was definitely on the rise in that time. And for me, Aaron as well. And I know, that he got his second reign within this decade here as well. But, I remember, meeting Aaron at I think it was 30 or maybe just before it, kind of watching him come up, because he won his first crown while I was Prince. So, 97 ish. And, just kind of seeing him and some of the other folks, kind of like on their way up, as it were. And yeah, I mean, Jonathan had been around for, he was Prince mid 90s as well. Eric and Nichelle were Prince and Princess of the Sun, mid 90s as well. And yeah. So all those folks are, definitely on the rise at this time.
So I also would, kind of nod a little bit to Aaron there, because just as a Meridian at that point in time, traveling, and when I would travel west, I normally wouldn't go much further, even though I did go to a couple of Estrellas, but I normally wouldn't travel much further west than Lily's War. But I ran into Aaron at Lily's War, met him in either the Water Bears tournament or the Children's tournament. We tore those water bears up.
What about the children?
We couldn't touch them, man. They were great. Now, those are two really cool tournaments they used to have at Lily's, where you'd be sponsored by a water bear, or you'd be sponsored by one of the children, and they were both a ton of fun. And then they were, early on for me, a good place for me to go kind of practice my way of thinking against the world. And Aaron was definitely part of the world that was like, wow, the world is strong and left-handed and big.
I mean, there's no doubt that he's a badass in his own right. So I think everybody's spot on.
Yeah, he's definitely a cool guy. So let's now think about the 90s overall. And I understand that from from Merrick's perspective, yours was from a drunken mercenary haze, and from Valora's perspective, yours is from what was written on the elementary school walls. But from Sean's perspective, you were living it. So let's talk about and play one of our favorite games. Brennan, take it away while I push the button on the overlay.
Who won the 90s? It is my favorite game. So, like Elenon said, I will just ask for your impression of the winner from any perspective you come up with. Who is the standout of the 90s? And we'll start with Valora.
I'd say Mark, because I heard the most ridiculous stories about Mark when I first started, and just the stories that nobody could touch him. Like, tournament didn't matter. Like, he was solid, and just redonkulous stories between him and his friends that happened.
Awesome. Thank you.
So
Merrick?
that's Mark von Neumann for full name effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to echo that answer. I think Mark, from even it was before my time. I mean, Mark's reputation definitely preceded him. But I'm gonna give a definitely a strong nod to Aaron Graves. I mean, I know. Aaron is such a strong fighter, and he's such a great builder of community. I mean, he to not mention him as one of the heroes of the 90s back then. I mean, I would give Mark von Neumann with Aaron Graves as a strong runner-up.
All right. Thanks. Sean?
Yeah, it's a split. I mean, the first half of the 90s are just very different from the second half of the 90s in Atenveldt. And early on, it was Thorfinn and Mark. Again, with that influence from Brian and Shalon, who still had a couple of reigns in the early 90s as well. So, I mean, all those guys, knights and squires together. I think, Brian had followed Thorfinn in one of his reigns, and Thorfinn and Mark following each other. So, yeah, there's that early part. And then later, you get Man and Arthur in particular, I think, because the two of them were so close together that, there's a lot of, I think they both had a pretty significant influence on the shape of Atenveldt after, Brian and Shalon had left at that time. But I'm a big fan of Aaron as well. I always have been since the first time I met him. He's just, he's a phenomenal human being, and just, somebody who loves our sport and has just always wanted to be better at it. And he just wants to be a better member of the society, as a laurel in his own right as well, So I don't know that I could pick who won the 90s. I mean, there's a lot going on there.
It does sound like it's a bit of a tale of two halves between the first part of the decade and the second part of the decade. And that definitely can happen. My outsider looking in perspective, and I don't get a vote, but while I absolutely love and adore Aaron, and he's like one of the first people I think about because he's one of the first people I knew from the kingdom. I think it's I think giving a nod to Arthur and the fact that Arthur has never gone away. He's almost as active today as he was then. He fights as much as he can, and he arts. He's working on things and making beautiful things, and he's got his fingers in the inner workings of stuff, and he's politically connected. I mean, he's never really, I think he's probably been an influential figure from the time he arrived and until now. So a lot of powerful figures from this period, and a number of whom are still very active. So cool. Let's get out of the 90s.
All right.
So we transcend into the 2000s, and this is probably where Merrick starts to come of age a little bit, and Valora, in about 5 years into it or whatever, starts to get started or whatever. So I really look forward to just sort of your overall impression of this period, because I think, people's first, 5-6 years in the SCA are so forming on their lives. No matter how much you may have grown in the last 5 years, and hell, I mean, Valora can't. Every time she goes to an event, she gets a peerage. So the last 5 years has been a whirlwind for her. But those first 5 years of your life in the SCA they seem like they just imprint upon you so strongly. So I'm really looking forward to kind of getting your guys' feedback on this. So let's talk a little bit about who was winning crown, who was winning 2 crowns back then. So, and also I always have to shout out, because all I'm really doing is looking at OP to get some of this. And if I ever miss anyone, let us know in comments and I'll fix the list real quick. But, in the aughts, the Dukes that were made at the time were Matthias in 2002, and then Eric right behind him in 2003, whom we spoke of quite a bit in the previous decade. Duke Jonathan there in 2004, Craven in 2006, Arius/Phelan, however you want to think of him, but he's Arius now in 2005, and Edward in 2008. That's a strong group of fighters there. There is a bit of a difference there also, because there's more this decade than the previous decade, and I think more than the previous decade before that too. So let's get the old guys' thoughts first, and then we'll move to the newer people. Sean, it's the 2000s, and you're still quite a bit around here.
Yeah, I am. I mean, having been, we were a principal at Estrella, through until about 2009. So yeah, I was, at Estrella a lot. And as an Atenveldt Knight, following along and just kind of, keeping tabs on the motherland as it were. And, still got a lot of friends down there. So I think really one of the significant developments in the 2000s is that block in the middle with Craven and Arius and Jack. I'd heard those guys talking about, how those crowns went for them, because I mean, it was like Craven had finaled with Jack, and then it finaled with Arius. And so like the 3 of them together were like in the finals all together, like all right at the same time. And it's like all 3 of them came to prominence like right then, like all together. And they were so closely connected in, finaling with each other in crown. And from an outsider's perspective, we talked about Craven being on the rise. I remember being at an Estrella or at a Penzic, where I think I fought all 3 of those guys at some point, Jack and Phelan at the time, and Craven. And it was striking to me, seeing that these were the guys that I knew from Atenveldt that were getting out into the world. Like you were saying, Alan, like I got to get out in the world and I got to see what the world is like. And I think that drive to see what the rest of the fighting community is throughout the world, I think really pushed the 3 of them in particular and really elevated all of them, because they wanted to be able to compete at a known world level, not just be able to compete within their kingdom, and not just to be the king of practice, and to be able to say, well, if I can just get by this one guy, then I can win a crown. I mean, these are some guys that were really putting in the work on a known world scale. And I think for all of them to have their crowns back to back or close enough, I know Jack did back to back reigns, but to have them all kind of come to fruition all at the same time I think was pretty significant.
Let's jump in next. Valora, you go.
I'm sorry. I got kind of lost listening to Sean. What was the question again?
It really isn't a question. It's what are your general thoughts about the major players in the prowess game during the 2000s? You were just starting to get your licks in about halfway through this decade, right?
Yeah, and I think that like one of my very first events was Phelan stepping down with Elspieta. And I definitely think just hearing the stories is that they did drive each other. They drove each other to be better quite a bit at that point. I think one thing that really starts to come into play in the early 2000s, and I know Craven wasn't the first. I think Duke Aaron was one of the first, but non-strapped shields start to come into play a lot in the early 2000s. I know. And just kind of developing a fighting style for a non-strapped shield and allowing people more movement, I think is something that really kind of started taking off. And just because I wasn't around for Duke Aaron's reigns, like I remember people being shocked that Craven won crown, that Craven won with a center boss. It was like, heresy that had happened. And I also think a little bit more of a switch of, because Craven is, we joke all the time, Craven is an SCA small. the perception that only a big, strong, buff dude, and I'm not twitting that Craven cannot hit hard. Please, Craven, don't hit me. But I think it kind of blew a lot of the perception that you had to be a big, strong, buff fighter in order to be a top fighter. Kind of blew that myth out of the water a little bit, kind of in the early 2000s. Because also, like Arius himself is not like a huge, big, strong guy. It came down to more to technique. So I think it kind of started to blow that stuff out of the water.
Good point.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about some of those very things before, we started the talk tonight. But, obviously, I think one of the first people I remember actually having a crown on and being king of Atenveldt was Aaron Graves. I remember watching guys like, Craven and Arius, Phelan at the time, whooping it up in crown tournaments and just watching these guys and learning. Not to me, it was, it also became lessons of like not just great fighters, but watching guys like Aaron and Craven and Jack, Jonathan von Trotha, and watching how these guys, watching them how they comported themselves on the field, throughout the day in a crown tournament when they got to the finals, if they won or lost, and just watching. To me, those were strong lessons of like how you comport yourself on the field, regardless of how your day goes. Especially if you're the winner or if you're the guy that you're the best loser. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, watching those guys being great examples of of that comportment was such a great lesson for me. But I was also thinking about something that which Valora just touched on, is you start to see a breakaway from you can only fight with the heater in Atenveldt, and that was how things were for a long time. I mean, the heater was this staple Atenveldt shield, and I would tend to disagree. I mean, I think Craven's kind of buff. He's a good looking dude.
I
He's
didn't call him ugly.
I don't want to don't put the man down. He's got some shortcomings, but other than that, he's a great guy. He's a great guy.
Shortcomings.
I just had to throw that out.
So you're speaking as part of the short guy, the short guy group
cohort,
or something.
The brigade.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think Valora makes some great points. You do start to see a lot of transitions, and I remember watching some videos from time to time about guys that fought in the 90s and and before, and it just seems to be such a muscle match, and it almost looks like Rock'em Sock'em Robots to a point. You really start to see a change from that style to a development of an actual martial art, in my opinion, starting into that time period of getting into the 2000s and early 2010s and moving on, and you start to see people actually start to put that thought and philosophy and that how that game starts to change and develop, and we start to think about, again, to the same point of not just technique, but we start to think about body mechanics and how does that change for a guy like Aaron Graves, who's 8 feet tall and left-handed, and a guy like Craven, who's 3 feet tall, and
also
sort of
left-handed.
also left-handed. And then you have a guy like Jonathan von Trotha, who's a beast, and he has the ability to bring both technique on a lot of strength and power behind everything that he does. So it really was, I think, a huge change culturally in this kingdom about how we looked at fighting.
So I know I started fighting Center Boss exclusively in '98 when I won my first crown with a heater, and as soon as I did, I was like, great, I'm not competitively fighting for the next 11 months because they're long reigns. They're 5 months as prince and 6 months on the throne there for the longest time. So I was like, so I'm going to work on my center grip thing, and so I started fighting with center grip, and that's pretty much all I've fought with since. But I enjoyed that you brought up that during this period between, Aaron and Craven, that center boss in Atenveldt, which I absolutely understand. The if you close your eyes and think about a fighter, it's still hard not to think about that Trelawn style shield and sword stance, and it's strapped to the arm, and and it had so much success for so long. So I throw this one at Sean. When did you start noticing out here in the desert kingdoms, the center boss starting to take off?
I know for us it was it had to be early, probably more like mid 2000s. We've kind of, being a child of Atenveldt and everything, the first few years that we had, there was a lot of the strap heater. I won my first couple of crowns with, the 22x36, right? The standard Atenveldt heater that I've been fighting with for years. And it was 2004 when I switched up to the square, because I wanted to go to a slightly smaller shield. To Merrick's point, my change to that smaller shield came from a martial arts perspective. Like, I wanted to make myself a better martial artist, and going to that smaller shield, and I'd fought against it, against some of the guys in the West as well, so I was a little bit familiar with it. But I know that was a change that I'd made, and not about that same time, Timmer won his first crown in like 2006 with a center grip oval, right? So that's where we're starting to see a lot of those changes, people getting away from, that standard, as much as we talk about the doors that they have down in Anstiora, the big square 22x36, well, the Atenveldt heater is the same size. It's just a heater. It's not, it's not blocked off, right?
It's not a barn door.
But it's the same dimensions, right? It is early 2000s. I think we start seeing people kind of moving away from, because one of the things about that type of heater is very much kind of a stand and deliver kind of system, right?
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it's stand and deliver, and some of these other things with the center grip, you get to move behind it a little bit. You get to you can put the shield in one place and move your body around it instead of moving your shield around your body, right? There's just a lot of versatility that it gives you. There's still something to be said for corners. Corners are corners block a lot of stuff that round edges don't block. But center grip heater, right? There's so many different things, and I think getting into just so many different things, not just the center grip stuff, but just so many different styles. It's fun, and I'd say early 2000s when that really started happening.
It's really interesting to me to hear y'all talk about that evolution, because my exposure to Atenveldt fighters starts around 10 years after we're talking about, and my impression of it is so much that center grip that to hear how much that evolution happens in 10 years is really interesting to me.
I think it had to be validated. One of the earliest phrases I heard was "swords follow swords." So it had to be validated. You got to go, oh, that dude that won crown had it. So people would honestly give it a chance.
Yeah. No, I mean that
Yeah.
that heater that Trelawn was using back in the 80s, that is what became the Atenveldt heater.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is a very specific size and a very specific shape, and it is the Atenveldt heater.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, Trelawn was wielding it with such success. Like, why would you try anything else? I mean, it
Right.
works for the right. But I still think to what Sean was mentioning earlier. I think again in the 2005 2010, I still think the center boss in Atenveldt is still kind of an outlier of a shield, right? I don't think you actually start to see it really start to take really gain momentum until you start getting into the 11s 12s 15s, right? Because even then, like the number of people that I can think of counting with a center boss, Aaron Graves, Craven, man was fighting with a center boss, Art started fighting with a center boss. I can still count on probably one hand the number of people that I can remember fighting with that center boss. And while those guys are great and they're legends in their own right, it's still a very small number, when you think about the community, that we are. So I don't really think you start to see this shift, but I don't think it really gains momentum until another 5 to 10 years.
It's a slower snowball. So,
Yeah.
and I don't want, for anyone who's listening to us, I don't want to disparage your shield style at all. Tournaments are still being won today by strapped shields and by tremendous fighters. Everything has an advantage and a disadvantage, and no one shield style is king of the hill at all. We're more looking at it from a trends perspective more than trying to cast some sort of judgment that one is better than the other. I do think it's kind of interesting. And my quick little center boss story is I started to get some success with it for a period there, and somewhere one of the Gulf Wars in the early aughts, Duke Baldar from Trimaris asked me to work with him on center grip, and I'm like, and I thought of him as being a strapped little, he had a little kind of square, almost kind of a rectangle, and those were in my mind the traditional Trimaris shield for that time period, and I was like, why do you want to shift to this? And he goes, well, I want to shift to it because I've been thinking that we play pretty much like we're naked. One good little shot and we're done. And while that's historically not necessarily how things were in the upper Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, that could be like how a lot of the fighting was per se, especially if you're doing a, armorless duel. So if one really good hit is taking out the damage, the period of time where that might have happened, pretty much everyone fought center grip. So I want to know what the deal is. And I was like, well, that's an interesting perspective, and I'm honored that you want me to show you. So let's see if I think of anything, invent some crap real quick and go with it. So 2000s, let's move into the training concept a little bit. Brennan, you have any thoughts on that?
So,
ask questions?
Yeah, and we talked a lot about the way that the valley sort of breaks up into these two camps. And is there anything that starts happening around this time that is not these two camps of the valley that drives the kingdom?
Triskathir.
What's that?
Tucson.
Okay.
It's a barony.
So
Cool.
Yeah, down in Tucson at this time, you've got Edward, and Craven was down there at the time, and was he up there? Was he up?
Craven was still in Phoenix, the early 2000s.
In Phoenix.
Also at the practice I started at.
Yeah.
Just so much pain.
Oh,
where was
much
Matthias? Was Matthias down in Tucson?
No, I think Matthias might have already he had already moved to the west by the time I started in 0506.
That was still middle 2000s. But down in Triskathir there was a bit of a surge down there as well that I think was kind of outside the influence of the Phoenix Central Valley, if you will. So,
and then you have these three folks that we've talked about really driving each other. What's the spill out from that? Because invariably you have the guy who's in the car with them, not just those three. who are they bringing up, and what is that doing to the fight culture?
That's a tough one. I don't even know if I know how to answer that question.
Yeah, they brought so many people up who fought so differently that it's really hard to specify one person or one thing, because like you got Craven, who brought up Sly and Tiernan and Reese, who all have completely different fighting styles. Jack brought up Sir Elias, and I think there were a couple more, but I don't know. I think it more starts to become, with shields changing, I think the training also starts to change. Of, at least I know in our area, they started looking less at you have to fight like so and so, or you have to fight like this, to more of what works for your body type.
Right.
So the shift starts to happen with those guys pushing each other and trying to be better. They had to start explaining what they were doing to train other people, which made them look more at themselves to be, you have to really understand what you're doing to teach somebody else.
Yeah.
So they had to really start looking at what they were doing, and it allowed those guys to really start breaking it down as, okay, this doesn't work for you, try this. This doesn't work for you, try this. And I also think you start to see a little bit of a shift from it being a lot less about ego. I'm the biggest guy at practice. I'm the biggest guy to do this. I'm the biggest guy. Like, I have to pummel everybody, to actually starting to get into more of a training mindset. How do I get better? How do I help you get better? So I think you start to, this shift starts to come in, at least at the practice I was at, and kind of in my brain.
What year are we in right now? I forgot.
Early
The 2000s.
2000s.
Yeah, I'll be.
Mid.
No, you might be right. I'll be honest. I don't think that mentality changed for us until the next decade, the 2010s beyond. I mean, I still very much remember, teaching, and training suit time, suit time, suit time. Get out there. The more people you fight, the more time you get in. The more you analyze, the more you break it down. The more you can slow it down and start to develop your own style. And and that's kind of that was my experience, at least up until about the 2010ish. Not much had changed for me at that point in time.
So thinking about, as an Easterner, we have Pennsic coming up, so Melee is on my brain. What are y'all doing at this point? Is there something y'all are doing to train Melee with Estrella on the mind, or just as part of your kingdom culture at that point, or is it really just a single centric training?
Brennan, that's a completely different episode. I mean, that is literally there's. I mean, the reason I say that is because Atenveldt. I think we used to have a really strong melee culture in Atenveldt. I mean, you go back to the decades that we were talking about before, and Sean can attest to this. I mean, we go out to our Baron of Atenveldt practice, and there would be
Park.
Yeah, I mean, there would be so many people at this practice. You would think it was a war. I mean, we had. That's what our melee practices were like. I mean, they were huge.
Well, they had so many people at Wednesday practice in Atenveldt that they had merchants.
Yeah,
it was almost fighter practice every week.
It was almost like going to a mini event. I mean, so it was melee practice in the earlier times that we're talking about, the 90s going into the 2000s. I think it was pretty strong, and and across the valley, regardless of where you were, you typically had at least one melee night of practice. In each region, at least once a month, right? And then once you start kind of getting into your 2005s, 2010s, that's when we really start to, you're going to melee practice for kingdom level practice to get ready for Estrella, right? And you're not practicing as often, you're not practicing as much during the week. I think that Atenveldt has always been a very tourney centric kingdom. And there's nothing wrong with that. I often wish that sometimes we would put a little more time into the melee side of things than we do, but the culture has definitely, in my opinion, moved away from that melee philosophy, but not to say that what the training that we do doesn't still translate. It absolutely does, but I definitely think that there's different skill sets that you learn you know, as a melee fighter than, you know, and being and going through that same repetition as you do as a tourney fighter, you know. So yeah, but I think we've kind of got and today, not to jump ahead, but I mean, there is no melee culture in Atenveldt anymore.
I don't know how much of training we were doing in melee as much as just doing melee practice. Like my one of my first introductions was melee was here's a spear, it that end you hit the guy with that, oh, go. Like it was lay on at that point. So I don't know how much exact training, like drills and stuff. I remember from later years, not so much the earlier years, but so like this time I think it's very much like it was Walking Dead. You picked a crew and ran with them, and it was their job to teach you, and they taught you how they fought. So I don't know exactly how much training is going on as much as just people fought.
It's so interesting. Like I feel like we just said opposite things, but yeah, I mean, because I mean, I can remember going to Twin Moons, and we would literally we would march as a unit. We would learn to wheel as a unit. We would learn to, you know, we would practice charging and pulsing as a unit. We would practice. We would call holds, you know, and practice, you know, learning how to stop and drop to your knees and putting your spears down, and you know how to properly, you know, react during a hold. And we used to do that at least once a month, and then we go out to Wednesday nights and try to put it to use, you know, where it was basically just melee-a-palooza. You know, you'd start out doing singles, you'd start out doing a bear pit, and then it would become, you know, melee stock. And let's you know, yeah, that's my answer.
I think I was taught it more on the household level, and then you would take it to practice and use it.
So we had a comment by one of the men right there, His Grace Trelawn, about the size of BOA fighter practices. So hats off to you, Your Grace. Comment/question. So it feels like, looking at it, that winning Estrella and Estrella's importance to the kingdom got to be such a big deal that it almost became, if it didn't, it became a bit toxic, to the point that almost had to do a course correction on just how important it was going to be. You know, so I mean, am I completely off base, or am I close to something?
I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head, but I think the important thing is that, you know, the leaders that kind of, you know, at the time, I think eventually some people started to realize the toxic culture that was creating, you know, and, you know, later on you have a couple of generations of people that were trying to fix that toxicity or that bad blood that it created between some of our neighboring kingdoms, because it was so important, right? I mean, and to your point, Brennan, like you're getting ready for Pennsic, and you know, I know how important winning Pennsic is, right? I mean, you know, if this was another show, we'd probably have to drink when I say this, but I mean, I can remember, you know, when you came down when I was crowned, and you know, I was crowned during Estrella, and you know, Jax and I were like, you know what, guys, like, there's no winner this year. Like, everybody wins. You know, there's no points. This is a friendship war at the end of the day. And I remember you turning to me, and you know, I hope I'm not, you know, stepping out of line by saying what you. But you looked at me like, if I could do that, like, you're like, I can't do that back east, you know. And you know, it you know, if nothing else, like, you know, I hope, you know, that you know, that level of competitive doesn't lead to the type of toxicity that, you know, and very much Estrella created, you know.
It did. I think we've likewise gone through a course correction, and I don't know if the same driver happened for y'all, but certainly internet, Facebook, the interconnectivity is a huge part of that course correction that I see. Like, just, it's really hard to hate my friends, right? and so when you actually travel and become friends with all of them and talk to them on Tuesdays on Facebook, it's a lot harder for them to be the boogeyman.
I think there was an added with Estrella of the proprietary issue of it's our war. Like, it's not anybody, we know your principles, but it's our war. And like, it took a wake up call realizing that we were the only ones in the sandbox, and went, what?
Nobody wants to
So
play with this anymore.
what?
I,
We
Yeah.
were we were
I can tell you
dicks.
that was a problem for us as a principal for a
Mhm.
decade.
Yeah, it doesn't matter your volunteer hours. It didn't matter that you guys had people on the staff. It's still our war. So I think you had to win the fighting, but the overall proprietary feel that we had to that war
Yeah.
also played a big role in people not wanting to play in our sandbox.
Yep.
Well, cool. Let's end this decade. So, Brennan.
Who won the aughts? This time we're going to start with Merrick. Thinking about an individual that, or a couple that really won the decade.
That's a tough one. I'm probably going to have a tie again, and for me, it's going to go back to Craven. And and I think about who the quote unquote heroes were for me as I was kind of starting to figure out how this game was played and what was going on. To me, I'm gonna have to tip my hat to Phelan, Arias as well. I mean, just because and that's no disrespect to anybody else from the time period. It's just those are the guys that I remember. Those are the guys I remember on the throne, and kind of setting an example. The one thing that I kind of love about the two of them is, one of them will kind of approach things from a more period perspective, and the other one taught me that it's an anachronism, right? So it's okay to throw in some other stuff as well, and it doesn't all have to be everything is period and everything is medieval, and we're allowed a little bit of leeway. So I was very, very grateful for those role models. Yeah.
Valora?
I'd agree. Matt and I agree on something. Yeah, I'd say Craven and Phelan for just they reigned a fair amount, but also like Craven brought in the kind of reiterated that a center boss or a non-strap shield could work, but Phelan also brought in speed and accuracy and just a lot of while still using a heater. So he was a big hat tip too. If you can do what you do better than anybody else, you'll win it.
Right on. Sean, your thoughts?
I was going to give the nod to Craven, but I think these guys have convinced me that just as we said in the 80s where Brian and Trelon were kind of inseparable, I think Craven and Arias both had such influence and I think are connected in a lot of ways that it'd be hard to say which of those was more influential. So I'll say, yeah, Craven and Arias.
All right.
And again, as a non-voting person, I'll throw in Aaron was still kicking a lot of ass early on in this decade. I mean, he's always kicked a bunch of butt, but he won a couple more crowns during the first part of this decade, and was still an amazing ambassador for the kingdom as well. I mean, just but without a doubt, you can feel Craven and Arias's influences to this day still. Just, Arias has had a number of, physical setbacks with how his body's working and everything, but I know that inside of him still an amazing fighter. It's just so fast. And Craven came this close to winning another crown just a few months ago. So, he's still a very dominant fighter and is still a dominant force. So a lot of really cool personalities that made their mark in this decade.
Yeah. And if I could backtrack, I have to, I would add Aaron and Jack as well. I mean, I think Craven and Phelan are kind of at the forefront for me, but I mean, I can't remember. I mean, I can't remember. I can't deny the examples that Aaron and Jack, were for me. And I think a lot of the younger fighters and the positive impressions that they made on this kingdom.
Awesome. Well, let's move into the tens because we're going to run out of time otherwise. I love these conversations though. Brennan and I both just get so lost in listening and poking to try to get one more question out of something. I think we could spend an episode on just a specific decade. I think for sure.
Absolutely.
So let's move on then. Let's take a quick look at the Dukes that were made, and hopefully I haven't messed this up too badly. But His Grace Tristan was the first Duke made in this decade, and then we got Little Morgan. Let's pop back up. No offense,
and then
but
Morgan, and then Ivan.
compared to the other Morgan, Little Morgan, in 2014, and then Big Morgan or Morgan Ethelwolf in 2017, and Ivan in 2018. Less Dukes made this decade, but those guys are all pretty darn amazing with their prow.
Well, I'll say again, there you have a little bit of spillover from the previous decade where you still have Craven and Arius and Edward, all reigning in this decade as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking the exact same thing. I mean, that was a great 10 years, right? Because while to the point of, there were less Dukes made, there's still a lot of bleed over of talent from the previous decade, right? Which is in its own way very impressive.
Yeah.
Well, Arthur wins early in that decade, so he's repeating.
Yeah, his third reign. Yeah.
And yes, so you got and then you got a number of counts, and I actually think a large number of counts is extremely healthy. But there's some really, really cool reigns during this period, and I think you get to see the talent spread out a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great time to remember, when guys like Art win, and you watch guys like Mark win now. I mean, all you old guys out there, you still got a shot. Don't worry, Craven. Don't worry, Craven. You still got a shot. You can still do it. No, just kidding.
Come on, little fella.
Come on, little fella.
Thanks, young buck, for giving us our flowers. But so let's just take a look, and let's Tristan early on, and that's Merrick's second knight, the one that took him to the finish line, I guess. But I mean, Tristan is tall, got long arms. It feels like you never really know. It never feels like the shot's done. It's like you keep blocking, and then you think you've got it, and then his shot just still keeps coming. So, but he's actually, I think, almost an outlier in this group, fighting a little differently than everyone else. Do you know what I mean?
He's a little more. I'd say he's a little more classic Atenveldt, right? I mean, it's the classic Atenveldt heater, right?
I think him and Morgan are actually pretty similar.
I was going to say, you think he's different because he's the only guy that's probably still holding on to the old Atenveldt heater, right? I mean, and that's not a dig, right? I mean, I think Tristan's a phenomenal fighter. He's got a lot of talent, and he put a lot of time and work into getting to where he was and where he is, right? I mean, he's not playing as aggressively as he was, but trust me, he's one of those guys that he can step out on that field at any time, and he's a threat, and he's somebody you got to worry about him. He is a phenomenal fighter.
An interesting footnote about Tristan is, didn't he final in like 4 crowns before he won? Like 4.
Yeah, I don't remember how many, but it was a lot. And I remember the one where he finaled with Craven. And I mean, to me, just to tell the story, I mean, I remember it was like the last time. It's the only time I've ever seen somebody. Tristan's a very tall dude, and as I like to joke, Craven is probably more average height. I joke that he's short, but he's definitely average height. But I watched Craven, jump from his knees and hit Tristan in the head, and I had never seen anybody do that before, and I was like, oh my god! But but just to watch, the emotion that went in with that with Tristan, I remember how because you're right, he had finaled in several, before he finally got there, and you start to realize that was, for me, was like a huge moment of realizing just like how emotional that stage of your career is, right?
Yep,
it was a pretty big eye opener.
I think a lot of people don't really give enough credit to the emotional impact of Crown in particular. there is an emotional expenditure that is involved in that people just are just not aware of, and navigating that and negotiating that that is the trick to winning crown multiple times over. We've talked about this on a couple of different shows, right? That crown is not it's not a physical contest as much as it is a mental exercise, and you being that close to Tristan on, and again, I recall it was like he'd finaled in 4 crowns in a row before he won. And, talk about always the bridesmaid, and that's just got to take a toll. And I guess you were right there to kind of watch all that unfold.
Yeah, but you kind of bring up another interesting point, about this era, and we talked about earlier how there wasn't a lot of dukes made, and there was a lot of repeats at this time. But the other thing is, there was a lot of really talented fighters that at this time that were making it to the finals that never really got over that hump. I mean, Sly finaled, if I remember correctly, a couple times. Elias finaled a couple times. I was just gonna say Dungal finaled 2 or 3 times. I mean, you have a lot of really talented fighters, that could and probably should be mentioned in the same names that we're talking about now, right? That just never got over that hump, and whatever that was, whether it was life took them in a different direction or with the mental game or whatever the case may be. But you have a lot of you have a plethora of talent on the field, and so it's interesting, when you think about the number of raw talent that's on the field versus, again, you still have the repeats and you still have a small number of dukes made, but man, the number of talent on the field during that time it was impressive.
I can say that when I moved here and started watching your guys' crowns, I felt like, first of all, they have close to twice as many people as a Meridian crown, but it was also so talent heavy and talent laden. I mean, you could look out there at and go, gosh, there's 10 people could win this crown. Now it might be one of the tournaments that you see Craven in or something like that, and you go, wow, but they're gonna have to get past this guy or whatever. But it was just really deep. The deep end of the pool was really good. I think it's one of the reasons, as much as anything else, I wanted to actually fight in a crown here, just because the talent level, the challenge was something that I really wanted to do, because it was really good and just really deep. And it's not just the level of dukes, as we were saying, the level of people who are count level, are counts at this point or almost didn't make it, are all that's making that deep end so rich, and it's just a really, really good talent laden group of folks during this period.
What size is an Atenveldt crown, average-ish?
30 plus.
About 3 to 4 inches. Oh, you.
Well done, young man.
In the 40s, I think, as well. Some of them.
I think the smallest one I've
mid-40s.
been in was 28. Largest was like 57, I think.
Yeah,
So, they're not like Western crowns or on tier crowns per se when those guys are really huge. But it was more than where I was from, and it was more than what I was seeing in kingdoms around Meridius as well.
And I think at this time, I don't remember exactly when, but about this time is when we start to switch from single fight double a limb to best 2 out of 3 double a limb in crown tournaments.
Oh.
So I know that's how it was in the beginning of Atenveldt, and then we went to single a limb, and now we're back at best 2 out of 3 double a limb. So you do kind of see a little bit of training kind of change, or mentality change towards longevity in a fight and efficiency in a fight. You kind of see that start to reflect in training. You kind of get away from, you throw the Atenveldt combos, offset, flat, blah, 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 blah. You start to see it get away from that a little bit to more efficiency in fighting. And you start to see kind of that flip to be able to last through a best 2 out of 3. It was really interesting to watch and see how people were switching that.
So you're talking about best 2 out of 3 for each fight, and as opposed to single fight double elimination, right?
Right.
Yeah, and one of the things that you get with that is, one of the reasons that we kind of went to it, at least for, we do a pulled list, but we do best 2 out of 3 for the quarters, finals, and semis. Like part of that is like anybody can beat anybody once, but being able to beat somebody consistently, 2 out of 3 fights it takes a greater measure of skill. And I think there was a period where when you do that single fight where you kind of like, and again, from an outsider's perspective, I'd seen some of these guys down there, like, well, I'm going to hang on to this one thing so that I can use it on this one guy so that I can get past this one guy, and there was a focus on that for a while, of being able to, train to beat an individual as opposed to training to be able to beat anybody anywhere. And I think that's where Jack and Craven and Arius, again, getting out in the world and being able to, like, how do I compete against the known world, not just compete against, in my crown. And having that best 2 out of 3 for each of those rounds, if you're going to hold on to your one trick shot so you can beat that one guy, well, that one trick shot's probably not going to work twice.
Might work once.
But
So I think
you have to actually have a
we
fight.
should point out that this best 2 of 3, this longer, harder, potentially crowns, the beneficiary of, and also one of the biggest proponents of this during this period is Morgan Ethelwolf, who,
Yeah, he started it.
I mean, he trains about as hard as anyone I've ever met. And he trains not only for the overall improvement of his prowess, but also for his ability to last deep into the tournament and have as much energy as he needs in the finals to fight best 2 of 3, best 3 of 5, whatever it takes. He's really strong in this area, both not only in his, what do I need to do to win the game, but how do I sustain myself through the day.
Yeah.
And that's what he works on his physical conditioning and he works on his prowess. He combines those two things as being, very close to each other. And so I think he's definitely, like I say, I know he's a proponent of, I was always a big fan of that style tournament, so I know that he's both a big fan of the style, but also a beneficiary of it, because I think he has won a few tournaments. He's won several in this decade. He's he wins 4 or 5. Let me double check. I think it's 4.
4. He's on 4.
Yeah. So it seems like 6 because one of them was 2.5 years long.
Yeah.
But he absolutely, kind of derailed my train of thought there, I think, because I got caught up in the numbers game. But
I can throw something in there too. I'd heard Morgan talking on one of the interviews that he had done that part of the reason for that is he had gotten to the finals of Crown and he lost because he just didn't have the energy. He just got wiped out and totally gassed out. And that's when he said that is never going to happen again. And then he I think he said he did the Insanity cardio program. Insanity, is that the one?
I think
it was
that's
P90X and then
P90.
So that was the thing is, having lost the finals of Crown because he just ran out of gas and he just said, that's never going to happen again. And that's where you see all this stuff you're talking about, Alan, on. So that's my understanding is that's kind of where that motivation came from.
Yeah, I think now's the time. To your points, you start to see that change in, conditioning and and endurance and stamina to our fights. But going back to building on what we were talking about earlier, you start to see this is when you really start to see the center boss become extremely prevalent in Atenveldt, which means now you're also seeing footwork and movement change in Atenveldt. You're seeing, and a lot of that also starts. What you also start to see is you start to see a lot more people traveling outside of Atenveldt to find fights in the other kingdoms, right? And I think society-wide, we start to see this culture of, people like, Duke Sean who are hosting like these big practices, private, on their properties, and other people are kind of mimicking and doing the same thing across the country. And suddenly you're starting to see people, travel just for the chance to practice with some people outside of their kingdom, not at a war, not at an event, but a private practice. I'm going to spend $300, $500, $700 on an air flight plus, possibly a rental car, whatever else, you might need to go train. And now we start to see a change in the mentality of, really, going from, if we talked about now, we start to see an evolution into a martial art, but now we start to see an evolution into a global training and sharing of knowledge, and if you want to jump ahead even further to the pandemic, we start to see things like this come out and analyze, global analyzation of video, so, you really start to see a more, the world gets smaller, I guess you could say, in your training pool, because now you're training with people across the known world.
Yeah.
On the regular.
Yeah.
Not once a year at Great Western, not once a year at Estrella, not once a year at, Penzic. It's on the regular now.
And I think Merrick is right. You also, in this decade, you see a big kingdom mental shift. For me, it had started earlier, but my practice I have found was very special. But in this time in the kingdom, you start to see that shift of losing ego, and it's less about I have to win, I have to be the dude who is the best, and you get to see more of the no, I need to be better. The shift of I have to win to how do I become a better fighter? That starts to become a lot more kingdom centric and a lot more kingdom accepted, I think.
Which weirdly, it's the key to winning.
Right. Yeah. To your point, Ailgheanan's the one that said it best. It's like, this is when we start training. We stop training to win crown, and we just start training to be the best possible fighter that we can be. Right.
Yeah.
And that's a huge shift in the mentality of, instead of trying to be good on 2 days a year, now I'm trying to be good every single day.
Yeah.
So I look at the number of counts that are, made in this decade, and I really feel like, there would have been more dukes, especially if some of these counts had been in other kingdoms. I really believe that, but they're having to compete against themselves. They're having to compete against very active dukes during this same period as well. So it's really hard to break in and get those 2 wins. But, you look at, I'm looking at everyone from Thomas to Brian to Oscar and, Matt, Merrick, and Franny. Those are guys that have all been in multiple finals. They got one during this, they were able to get one in this decade, but they had already been in multiple finals, and I strongly believe that they would have won a lot of other tournaments. So it's just really hard to get your strawberry leaves, I guess, during this period. But a lot of really outstanding fighters that are I know I was thrilled when I moved here because I had this talent pool to start, competing against and working with, and it was really great. I look especially like, when I first started and met Casca, I was like, how is this guy not a royal peer? He is so good and so strong, and had a little bit of a mental block, I think, in being able to finish in crown list. But the guy would just tear you up in practice, and you're just like, oh my gosh, this guy. And I love Casca to death, but I never ever wanted to be hit by him. He doesn't know how to hit light because he's just so strong.
It's kind of what I was thinking about when we were talking about Morgan earlier. A lot of these people that we're talking about, are finaling in crown. Not only that, but they're finaling, they're winning in really great known world tournaments other than crown, right? They're doing exceptionally well, at Outland's prize tourney at Atenveldt. They're doing exceptionally well, at champions fights and tourneys at Penzic, and at the Roses Cancer tourney, which we don't do to win. It's not what we fight, but it's still a pretty impressive tournament. When you have people that are winning and final.
We don't do it to win.
Well, that's the reason, right?
I've been doing it wrong.
That should be the main focus, right? It should be about what the
correct.
About, but
hey, you say tournament, and that sets a certain flag in my programming.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? You have a lot of these guys, a lot of these people. That are performing well, not just in crowns, but in these really impressive tournaments across the known world.
Yeah.
So, quick programming note: we're getting close to our normal stop time, but I want to go just a little bit long this evening, just a little bit longer, to make sure that we touch and give this decade what we can, what we gave the other decades. So, if you can, bear with us. I promise we won't go too long, but we will. We do want to just hit a couple other topics before we get out of here. So, thank you for your patience, folks. Brennan, any thoughts? Any questions?
I am loving this conversation. I just want to start with that. Being the fly on the wall that doesn't know all these folks well, you guys have brought them to life. So thank you for that. Anything that you think really changes in this period that we haven't talked about, that in terms of the way folks fight or the way folks train?
I think one thing I want to bring up was I think Craven really brought to, and I know he must have been doing it before, but Craven got really known for that you are not stationary on your knees. So he really kind of brought that forward with you're not stationary, you're not dead just because you're legged. So people actually started to practice, like needing to practice to fight from their knees and practice being mobile from their knees. So I think that's also something that you see popping up as well, is just that movement on your knees.
It's the goofiest thing we
Oh,
do,
it's
but if
so
we're gonna do it, you may as well practice it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I shook my head no at the start of that question, but I something kind of came to my head, and you know, I think the other thing that we start to see change that we haven't discussed is, honestly, it's going to sound so silly, but therapy. And when I say therapy, I mean we start to talk about the mental side of Crown. Remember we were talking about Tristan and like how emotional it was that you get there, and it's like now we start to prepare fighters for that. We start to see, like when you get there, like, you know, look, you've got the chops, you've got the skills. There's no doubt about that. You're crown, you know, that you're a crown level fighter. But until you get it through your head that, you know, whatever your mental blocks are, you know, you talk about guys like Koska, you know, until you figure out those mental blocks and you get over those hurdles, those are the things that we're starting to see help each other a little bit more now with, that I don't think happened in the past.
I also think there's a leaning towards because when earlier it was very much of you fought all the time, didn't matter if you were injured, didn't matter if you were, then you start to see a shift of, oh, you're hurt, don't put your stuff on, you're going to lead to permanent injury here. So you start to see more of a shift that way as well, of like mentally but physically take care of yourself, icing after, and you start to see a lot of that pop up too.
And we talked about that on one of our episodes recently, that we are better as a sport at large of not pushing people to fight, certainly injured, but also hurt. You know,
we don't always listen, but
right,
the pressure is not there.
Right.
Of you have to.
Yeah, and we're just, I think we're better as a sport at large at that. And it's probably been in the last 10 years that we've actually, you know, gotten better about that.
We're a little less rub dirt on it and a little more. You should just come off the field, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is good. Of course, you probably, when you're saying we are better as a sport, could just stop right there, because I think we're better as a sport across the board.
Yeah.
And you know, it's something that we're having to work on, and you know, but I think you're seeing how quickly a person anymore can kind of become competent from zero to competent is helped in a lot by the fact that we're better as a sport, full stop.
Yeah, we're definitely teaching our sport better than we were 20 years ago.
All right. Well, anything else about this decade we really need to hit? Because if not, we'll move into the finals of our conversation. All right, then. Well, let's do it.
Who won the 2010s? Sean, you haven't led this conversation off yet. I'm going to throw the question to you first.
Morgan Aethelwolf, without a doubt. There's just, besides the number of crowns that he's won, there's just not been anybody else that has had the influence that Morgan has had. He won back-to-back crowns, including one which ended up being 2 years. But his rise to prominence and the influence that he's had, I think a lot of people don't understand the impact that Morgan had on Estrella War in particular, in getting some of the kingdoms that had left to want to come back again. He made a lot of strides in making sure that everybody was having a good time, and kind of started alleviating some of what Valora was talking about as far as the proprietary nature of this is our war. And I don't think he gets enough credit for his efforts there. But there's no doubt. In this particular decade, Morgan, hands down.
The only thing I would add to that is Morgan and Liz, because he's not much without her. No. She has worked just as hard to bring goodwill back to both Estrella and to the kingdom. They're a great team. They really are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say Elizabeth Aethelwolf won the 2010s without a doubt. Without a doubt. I mean, and for a lot of the reasons that you both just said. And Morgan is very much a close second, and I'm gonna actually throw Craven in as a close third, because there's a lot of things that I'm very well aware that Craven did behind the scenes when it came to rebuilding Estrella, and he was very much a strong part of that as well. But I mean, if you want to talk about the outliers and the shining lights that really kind of helped heal this kingdom from some of the toxicity that happened before, a lot of it's going to lie on those three people's shoulders.
I'm incredibly horribly biased, but I would also say Morgan. And just for his influence and his training method, he is very good at breaking down a fight. He's also very good at saying the same thing in different ways. If you can't hear it one way, he will figure out a different way to say it. And I'm going to big shout out to Craven. I think the fact that Craven was still a big competitor in Crowns was pushing people to be better. And then I am totally going to shout out Ivan as well, just because he is such a fun fight and such a different technical fighter, but also he just has an amazing poise on the throne that is just fabulous. So I'm gonna shout out those guys.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So that kind of closes us out, and SCA in Atenveldt has run a little bit full circle. Duke Mark won the last crown list, and so it's amazing to see figures from the past reemerge and do really well. He's still just such a beast. But Atenveldt is an amazing kingdom, and it's been an awful lot of fun these last 2 episodes to dig into its history and to talk about some of these really just incredible figures in SCA history. So I'd like to thank our guest, Merrick and Valora, and Sean, who's only sort of a guest. He actually lives here. So, but Brennan and I are both really grateful that you guys could spend an evening with us and talk about kingdom history and fighting in general. And we're just thrilled to be able to participate, even if it's mostly ask dumb questions.
This was super fun, y'all. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
You.
Appreciate it.
All right, well, we'll see you guys next week. Sean, do you have any idea what's our next episode?
I think next week we are talking about mind games. We're going to have Branos, I think I'm on. We got Duke Michael from here in Artemisia. The games we play on the field and how we manipulate people, how we read our opponents and let them be manipulated. and all that good stuff. So I think that's the next one is the games we play.
And a quick programming note, we're going to hold off on the next kingdom, which is Meridies, until the other side of Penzik. So we've got some Penzik programming we wanted to do. So we'll take a break there, and I'll throw some shout outs as to when that next episode is. I know we've got Duke John the Bear Killer who's going to join us for that to talk about the first years of Meridies, and a couple other guests if I can snag them, but that should be a lot of fun. But that'll be on the other side of Penzik. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you soon.
All right, have a good day.